Hey guys, welcome back to Planet Coaster. Today I'll be working on finalizing the Mainstreet, or at least most of it, by finishing the pathwork which was still left to be done, and adding some extra buildings. I definitely won't finish everything yet, and there won't be any big weenies or very iconic buildings in this episode. Just generally finishing off the Mainstreet with some of the buildings which I still had to do, and make the way for the next episode in which I'll be able to completely finish the Mainstreet and also add all the signs of life to make it look like a proper theme park. Because at the moment, truth be told, it's still gonna look a little bit lifeless, mostly about just getting all the buildings done and making sure that the entire street is all finished, but not actually go into making a real sort of theme park atmosphere. It's really just all about the buildings today, and the first one which I wanted to make is right next to the one building which most of these buildings are going to be variations on, and they're all going to be very much like this French townhouse-ish building, and just in general every building is going to have its own sort of variations on the different parts of the building. So with this one I figured I would actually have a cornice which is made out of multiple of these beams. I actually didn't realize though until I watched this time-lapse spec just before this episode that the windows are still sticking through, and at this point in time they still are, so that's probably something that I do want to return to in the future. But it's a pretty simple building aside from that. Like these buildings are not going to be really the eye-catchers, so they won't have as many details as, for instance, the big weenies or iconic buildings would have. And also I kind of like to very subtly almost rank it per height. So the highest buildings, which will stick out most, will also be like the most detailed and the ones that I'll focus on most. So the one to the left of this building is, in that sense, I feel a little bit more important than this building. It definitely doesn't mean that I want to just quickly do these buildings and just spend barely any time on them. It just kind of means that they are not going to be the sort of main draws to the area. Though I really do have to say, I started recording these episodes thinking that I would get these done pretty quickly and just kind of get done with it and get the Mainstreet to be all done. But while I started doing it, I actually found myself actually putting a lot more time than I was planning to into all of these buildings and all the little details that they have. So this first one is still very similar to the first original townhouse, just a little bit lower to get that sort of gradual progression between of like having the buildings toward the plaza be a little higher than the buildings in the rest of the middle of the Mainstreet, really. And it's also, I find, just a lot more fun to have buildings with slightly different heights. I do want to keep some sort of an ensemble, like not have too big differences in the heights between buildings, but generally I want to try to avoid having buildings right next to each other which are exactly the same height, which will only happen at one case in the entire Mainstreet. Now the building over here is going to be a corner building already, and is going to be like the first building that you see as you come into the park, but I'm not going to actually spend too much time trying to get corners, really like interesting towers on the corners or really interesting decorations on it. I actually want to make this corner building a little bit more generic, because the idea behind the plaza where you enter is that it's not really as much of a main plaza as the first square is in, for instance, the Disney Mainstreet, but it's just sort of the place where you get into the park. And the idea is that you should be drawn more toward the round plaza, which the main weenie, like the main palace right here, is also located. So these buildings are just gonna be like a very small sort of entrance place, but they're not gonna be as fancy as most of the corner buildings. Just a way to get a building on the corner, but not something that like draws a lot of attention, because I really want the buildings behind these buildings as you come into the park to draw most of the attention. It's also, and this is something that you'll actually be able to see in the real-time parts at the end of this video, which I added just to show off the park a little bit more, that much of the effect of these buildings, by sort of having this little zigzag path, is that the street ends up looking a little bit larger than it actually is, and a little bit more urban and packed. But also you have this interesting sort of perspective and interplay between these buildings, where if you come in, you first see this building right at the front, and then you have the dome building sort of half well behind that, and then all the way at the back, right in the center, as you come into the park, you have the main tower of the palace, which is sort of the idea behind this entire street. I didn't plan it out that well, but that was more or less the general plan and what I was hoping at the time would actually work and be a good way to get into the park. And yeah, aside from that, this building's actually heavily inspired by the other corner building, which is right next to the domed corner building over there, which is the one with the same sort of red wooden little roof sticking over it, and it also has some somewhat similar windows. I did try to get unique windows and unique pillars and all that stuff on the different buildings, but this one is really similar to the other corner building in the sense that it has this small little patio with a small overhang roof with the red wood over it and stuff like that. And while it doesn't even have any of the like more interesting corner building tropes like a small tower or a little dome on the corner, it was quite interesting to see how well the dormers actually work on the buildings. I haven't played around with dormers really at any time before, since I really figured they wouldn't really be possible to make that well. But turns out they actually work really well by having these different like building attachment pieces and combining them with the windows. And it's not just something that's a lot of fun to do, and not just something that can look really good, but there are also many different combinations that you can make already with the pieces in Alpha 1 to make your own sort of custom dormers, which is really cool to see, and also really just a lot of fun to do as well. Now the building over here is also going to be one of these really standard townhouses. I was trying for a second there because I figured it would be nice to get a different roof, to get the the top of one of these brick pieces to be the roof, just to see if I could get a different roof texture. Also tried to have this slightly curving roof for a second there, but neither of those ideas really worked out, so I just went with the good old sign trick at some point. If anybody's wondering why I don't exactly use these signs in a way that I used to do them before, which is by actually sinking them into a roof just to get a completely flat surface, it's just something that takes a lot of effort, and you can't really get the slope exactly right. Like, many of these townhouses have really steep roofs, and it's something that you can't really recreate very easily if you try to attach them to any surface, because no surface of any object in the game at the moment is as steep as this, and we don't exactly have the rotation of Alpha 2, which is going to be a huge game changer when you'll be able to just rotate objects in whatever direction you like. So this was really the only way I felt, and the easiest way to make a steep roof like this. And then just for a bit of detail, just to make the detailing come out a little bit more, I do like to place these wooden poles in the middle of the chimneys, which is... chimneys? What? Of the pillars, which isn't exactly the most realistic thing. It's definitely not a realistic thing at all, but it's just something I kind of like to do with these things, just to make them pop out a little bit more, like... because everything from the balconies to the concrete beams, to even some parts of other objects has the same sort of concrete texture to it, and I really felt if I would use it too much and even have the pillars be entirely the same texture, nothing would really pop out as much. Like, details always pop out a lot better if they have slightly different textures or contrasting colors, so that's why I did want to use the wood as a sort of way to get the pillars to stick out a little bit more, or pilasters I should say, by having them have this slightly different and darker texture. For the dormer, I was actually quite happy as well with using these window top pieces as a way to get a slightly more fancy shape with the dormer going. I just realized I never actually used these pieces to put them on top of windows, which is, I guess, just one of the pre-alpha things. It's just something that they are supposed to be used in a certain sense, and I definitely don't want to say that you shouldn't use objects for what they are meant to be used for, but very often, especially in a case of the first alpha of Planet Coaster where there aren't too many pieces yet, everybody ends up using these pieces for what they are meant to be used for, because that's what they're meant to be used for. So you kind of really get used to the way that they look, so you instantly like recognize a window as, right, that's that exact window, and that's the piece that is supposed to go with it, and it sort of becomes really recognizable. And I feel that could like break the immersion a little bit more, at least a little bit more than trying to combine some of the different window pieces to make new windows, which is not just more fun to do, I find, but also just more fun to look at in the end when it's not so recognizable and repetitive to see. Oh, and though I'm starting on the new building already, it might be interesting for a bit to just talk a bit more on the details on the last building, which are, I think, just some of the best ones out there, at least in terms of color. I was trying to kind of like find some ways to get different colors into a building, because one of the problems, obviously, at the moment is the lack of different colored walls or the ability to recover things, so very often you get this enormous blue hue to everything, because most of the pieces in the game are blue at the moment, or if you avoid the color blue, everything starts to become this sort of grey, dull or brownish color. And at least by trying to use the doors underneath the windows, which doesn't really make any sense from a functional perspective, I tried to get some like slightly red accents in there. And the same kind of goes for the cornices actually, by using that wood just to get some different colors into the building to make it look a bit more interesting than just having all of the same colors. I think you can probably compare it a bit with the building right next to it on the right there, which is the domed building, which doesn't really have too many colors on it, and as a result doesn't really look as interesting. These are also, by the way, the only buildings which are the exact same height. Moving on though, this is just another one of these townhouses where I just tried a couple of new things. This one actually feels somewhat Amsterdam-ish. I'm not entirely sure why. It's kind of like the top dormer is almost like a clock gable with the way that the wall is placed underneath it. And for this one I just wanted to try and see how well it would actually work to have the middle section have a slightly different texture, just for a small change. And it's also nice to have those little decorations that comes with the little wall piece on the building there. And kind of just put some of these roof pieces as little accents on the top of the roof there, just to decorate it a little bit more. And foliage, I felt, was also really important. Like, foliage feels really necessary if you want to make something look charming. No matter how much effort or how many details you put into a building or buildings, it always feels like it's a bit empty and missing something when there isn't really a lot of foliage. Especially on Mainstreet, so I do tend to have a lot of foliage. Though the one challenge I had with the foliage in this Mainstreet is that it shouldn't obstruct the main sightline, which is from the entrance towards the main tower. Hence why I didn't put any foliage on the right side of the Mainstreet here, but sort of just put some cypresses and a simple tree around the left side. Also, and this I've said before and it goes without saying, but if you ever have any building where you're like, I'm not entirely sure if this is really a good building and I don't think I'm really happy with it, just put some foliage or a lot of foliage, depending on how much you don't really like the building, in front of it, and at some point it's actually gonna look good. And if it's really that bad, you can always put that much foliage in front of it that you just barely can't see the building anymore. And it actually works. It's a pretty good trick to keep in mind. Foliage just makes a lot of things look a lot better. And the same really goes for something that I probably also don't have to say, and I've said quite a lot in the past as well. But I always tend to also be quite judgmental of my works while I'm sort of working on it, and it's definitely something you should try to avoid, but it's so hard not to do it. But what I always find is that without having foliage around a certain area, it just looks so much worse than when you add foliage. Like, sometimes you build something and you're not entirely sure if you're really happy with it. Just wait until you get to the foliage, because as soon as you add foliage to an area, it could change really drastically and suddenly look a lot better, or a lot more charming or inviting. Now, I completely forgot about the entire time-lapse. That was just a quick building as like an almost little shop building. I did have a lack of actual shops that really work. There obviously isn't a really huge assortment of shops that we can build in the game, but I just wanted to have a small restaurant which people could actually visit over there, just to make that corner building, because it is more or less a corner building at this spot here, a little bit more inviting, and also set the sort of theme park mood as you come into the park. And the building on the little corner here, which might actually be the smallest building of the entire Mainstreet, I am pretty sure it is just a little extra building. It's not too important, though it does help to make the overall shape of the Mainstreet a little bit nicer. I find I had the idea that like the building right on the corner, I wanted to make the smallest building, and then the corner, then the building which faces the rest of the Mainstreet more should become like gradually larger. So the very smallest building on the left here, and then as you enter the Mainstreet, you have the largest building on the right there, which is quite a tall townhouse, just to get that sort of yeah, sort of progression of tall buildings toward the middle of the facades, just to have, I guess, also a bit of forced perspective-ishness, and draw people more toward the center of the street there. And also because I just kind of had to wrap up the building around here. Like, there's not much plaza left anymore, and I couldn't really fit another building in here, so I just really had to wrap up this building around this side and call it a day for that. Though I did want to still quickly add some very small backstage sort of area, which I'll still get back to. It's really simple at the moment, but I generally just want to have these buildings to get a sort of realistic theme park sense as you look over the park, though I won't go completely into detail with that and actually have concrete floors around these areas as well, because that's something I really can't get into. And sadly there aren't any forklifts or any trucks or containers or stuff like this, which would be really awesome to see at some point in the future though. Hint hint. But yeah, that is right about it for the time-lapse for today. I'm running out of time-lapse at the moment, but I still have one real-time part to show. So thank you guys for watching for now, and I'll give it over to my old real-time self for a second here. Alright, so just a quick tour of what I've been up to in real time, because I think the format does work a little bit better to show off some of the things, especially from the ground up. Even though the main street isn't completely finished yet, so I don't want to go too much into detail, and I also don't want to start showing off too many things right now. But yeah, some of the things I think are much easier to explain and show off from a real-time part, of course. And the most important thing is actually sort of the main sightline that I wanted to keep in mind, and also actually a reason why I felt a curved main street, as strange as it is in the way that this one is built, because it's really unconventional, would actually work, is because you have that like tower at the end of it, and you can see it from like the entrance part, so as you just come into the park. But it's also a bit more interesting than just having the sort of the Disney kind of castle, I think, because there's more like a zigzag pattern to the streets, especially if you move like over here, or maybe less unfinished stuff on the side there. But like the path kind of zigzags, and there's a building more in front over here, then there's this building sticking out on this side, and finally in the middle you have this tower sort of being the main big weenie over there, which was the general idea. It also kind of helps to make the street seem a little bit larger than it really is, because in reality this is a really small main street, and also in hindsight I probably could have made it a bit wider, because it is quite narrow to deal with all of the guests which come into the park. But you know, the general shape of it, and hell, even the fact that it's so narrow, does really help to make it look a little bit larger than it really is. Because this is all just one building, but as you like kind of walk in here, you can't really see any of the edges of it. It's all sort of just very neatly hidden. Oops, if I can actually get the camera to be good for a second. It's very neatly just hidden by the general shape of the building, that it kind of looks like you're in the middle of a cityscape, even though these are just more or less 3 buildings, of which 2 kind of large buildings, but just restaurants, and 1 sort of, I don't know, main sort of building of the park. And the same really goes for this side, though it's the most unfinished side. This is my favorite side of the main street, though, if we're gonna divide it into right and left, and it's mainly because I just love how these townhouses, whoops, over here came out, and they're very French-ish, and they most resembled what I was going for. I'm quite happy with all the townhouses in general, actually, though it took a lot more time than I originally actually, well, expected. It also came out a little bit better, though I have to say, I sort of went into this, of course, thinking that I would just quickly wrap up the park before things went horribly wrong, but I couldn't stop myself from just having lots of fun with these buildings. So maybe the park will be fucked, and it's all my fault. But I'm still on a good 12 FPS, so that's nowhere near the problem zone. But yeah, anyway, there's also the restaurant over here, which I didn't quite show off very well yet, which very much looks like it could be a state capitol building, but it's just a restaurant. I was at first really afraid that like it would be dwarfed by the townhouses around it, since these buildings are quite a bit larger than the first 2 floors of this building. But the dome sort of helps offset that, and I also feel just by having it be a little bit smaller, it almost feels like it's more of a gap between the townhouses, and it looks a bit larger, as opposed to having this huge wall of high buildings over here, which might kind of dwarf the plaza in the middle of it. So I am really happy with how that turned out as well. The the similarities between these two domes are pretty much everywhere, though. They're just carbon copies, except for the little cupola on the top of the building. Though I do have to say, this dome is slightly different, and I do think it looks a bit more clean than this one, which just kind of has all sorts of random stuff on the top of it, just to make it look a little bit fancy. And this cupola is actually something that I'm really happy with how it turned out, and the skulls actually worked surprisingly well to make that little sort of dome on top of the dome. So yeah, that is the main street at the moment. I just noticed I need to put a roof on this building too, so that's gonna have to happen sometime soon. And the other stuff that I still want to do is, well, obviously finish this little plaza over here, because it just really needs something, though I'm not entirely sure what it's going to have. Just some general shrubbery and general path elements. I mean, I still need to get to light posts and benches, but even signs and some other nice little details on the buildings themselves. And I also work on 1 or 2 buildings over here. I'm not entirely sure if it's going to be 1 or 2. Kind of depends on what I feel like, and kind of depends on what works. But just 1 townhouse, maybe that's 3 tiles wide, for a change might actually work over there as well. And on the other side, I kind of want to do a similar thing. I'm not quite sure if I want to have 2 or just 1 house over here. But I'm gonna put like something really simple here just to kind of finish the main street off. And from that point onward, it's more or less going to be finishing the park, and I am not entirely sure how much I'm still gonna do with it, since I am kind of well, I don't have a lot of time to work on it, but also I don't have a lot of frame rate left to work on it, and it's become a lot worse lately. I know I'm on 12 FPS right now, but the last couple of days I've actually had major issues, and I think it was because of the heat wave in the Netherlands that my PC was just kind of hot. But I just had massive click lag and mouse lag, which pretty much made the game unplayable. I was still on 8 FPS, so it should have been fine, but even the UI was lagging at that point, so I'm not entirely sure how much further I can actually push this park. So instead of trying to get into new areas over here and add many different buildings, I just kind of want to wrap it up and try to wrap it up as neatly and quickly and as efficiently with the smallest loss of frame rate as I can. And it definitely won't be a finished park in the end, and it'll just be really rough around the edges. Like, this is not really going to go anywhere, and it's gonna be very awkward in terms of path layouts. I was really hoping to like make some large areas over here to make the park as a whole come together more in terms of layout, but that's something I don't think I can really do, and it's not a risk that I really want to take. I'd just rather finish this park, get it out before the next alpha comes out and it becomes completely outdated, and just get a file online so people can download this park. So yeah, that's what I'm gonna do. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll get back to work soon.